Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. On 6th May, after a 42-hour-long operation, Riyaz Naikoo, the Hizb commander, and his close associate Adil Bhatt were martyred by Indian occupation forces. The operation began on 4th May at 10 p.m. 3 houses were razed to the ground by occupation forces, and 15 others were partially damaged. Occupation forces also dug up fruit gardens in the vicinity. The houses were destroyed by explosives which security forces forced the civilians to plant. Civilians were also used as shields and were sent into houses first as probes. After the encounter was over, another group of civilians was sent to first inspect the spot on the direction of the forces and check the location of the bodies in the rubble of the destroyed house. These facts have been reported by sections of the Indian media and are based on witness testimonies from the ground. All these actions violate international law provisions. India's occupation strategies have increasingly followed the Israeli playbook. This is not the first time Indian occupation forces have used civilians as shields. The practice got exposed when a major tied Farooq Dar, a civilian, to the bonnet of an army jeep. He was awarded the army chief's commendation card even before the inquiry into the incident was over, effectively prejudicing the inquiry result. After the martyrdom of Naikoo and Bhatt, clashes between civilians and occupation forces erupted in Beghpora and other parts of southern Kashmir. Scores of civilians were injured. The occupation forces used bullets and pellets to control the protest. At least one civilian, Jahangir Yusuf Wani of Pulwama, died of gunshot wounds. Several others received pellet injuries in the eyes. The father of Riyaz Naikoo had to travel 4 hours to Sonamarg to claim the body of his son, but he had already been buried by the occupation forces. The practice of handing over bodies to families has been discontinued. Sources say the policy was changed because every death led to more protests against Indian occupation and the raising of Pakistan flag. The practice now is to take away the bodies and bury them without the family's presence. All this is happening in occupied and annexed Kashmir while the world grapples with the COVID-19 threat. To discuss the deteriorating situation in the occupied land, we are joined today by Zaffar Qureshi, who is chairman of Kashmir Campaign Global, and Dr. Claude Rakisits, who has had 20 years of experience in the Australian public sector, including in the Departments of Defense, Foreign Affairs and Trade. Thank you to both the panelists. Let me begin with Mr. Qureshi here. Mr. Qureshi, starting with the fact that, what I've stated in the opening is something that is reported by the Indian media. The destroying of the houses, of fruit orchards, digging up, excavating ground because, looking for tunnels, sending civilians to plant explosives, and sending civilians first into destroyed houses. This is now the common practice there, and it violates international law by all standards. What is your reading of the situation, and what are your reports from the ground?
Thank you very much, Ejaz Haider. Indeed, the situation is dire. You're right. The Indian occupational forces at the moment is breaking every international covenant to protect the civilian lives. Every technique has been implemented to kill and destroy the Kashmiri innocent civilians. I mean, it was not me reporting it or you, it's the economic and the Indian media, Economic Times and the Indian media, who's reporting how the Indian army is using the civilians to implant explosives, to go and check on the martyred people, to putting them at a risk in a war situation and ensuring that the civilian population is being targeted and killed. This is not just inhumane and breaking the international covenant, but the international community must take a cognizant.
Dr. Rakisits, what is your reading of the situation, and what does international law say in relation to such practices?
It's completely against international humanitarian law, what is being done using, civilians as shields to protect the military to do their job. But the fact is that this, again, feeds into the narrative, and the important fact is that what is happening, and when one needs to look at the bigger picture of what's happening in Kashmir, is that this situation simply cannot continue. They can bump off as many leaders, militant leaders as they want. This will not resolve the issue. And the reason they are militants is because there's a problem in Kashmir. And until that problem and those problems of self-determination of the Kashmiris is dealt with properly, satisfactorily to the Kashmiris, this will continue.
No, so absolutely. I mean, I must say that I agree with you there. But the question really is, how does one prevail upon the government in Delhi to understand this? Now, what we have seen since the arrival on the scene by Narendra Modi and more specifically his National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit Doval, who has had a certain approach towards Kashmir, which as a private citizen he expressed in 2010, and that particular speech, that talk is on the internet. I mean, anyone can go and listen to what he was saying. And that approach is that we need to take, according to Delhi, quote unquote, bold steps and double down. There's going to be an initial groundswell, but if we keep at it, we will be able to tire them out. Now, if that is the strategy, then I'm afraid it's very difficult to make Delhi understand that the real problem is about the right to self-determination of the Kashmiris.
Hear you. I agree with you. The fact is, India, as you know, pretends to be the largest democracy in the world. And with this behavior, which is utterly illegal in international law, this simply cannot continue. Now, even Western leaders, whether it's the French leaders or the British leaders, or even American leaders, all starting to notice that what is happening in India vis-a-vis Kashmir is simply wrong. And they're starting to make more and more noise about this. And of course, there was a scathing report by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, not only just before the 5th of August, the famous date when everything was reversed, about human rights abuses in Kashmir for many years now, but also there was a more recent report about post 5th of August saying that they had to, restore the rights of Kashmiris. So what I'm trying to say is that, sure, Prime Minister Modi can continue on doing what he's doing, but there will eventually, this will come to the attention of the international community, and it's not going to fit the international community's narrative that India is a country to back because it's the largest democracy. This does not work with, democracies simply don't do this sort of things. And at the end of the day, and I don't think it's only my view, even Indian generals, I was reading an article just recently today, an Indian general just wrote today, Lieutenant General D.S. Huda, who was a commander in Kashmir, said, sure, we can go after the militants, but at the end of the day, we are not going to be able to win the hearts and minds of Kashmiris with this sort of behavior. So even its own generals agree this is not going to work.
Absolutely.
So what I'm saying is, I think history is on the side of the Kashmiris and not on the side of Prime Minister Modi. And he would know, and if you and I know this, he would know that it's not going to work out for him. He can bump off as many people as he wants. At the end of the day, there's going to be more and more resentment, particularly by the Muslim majority in the valley, in Kashmir, and it's simply not going to go away. There has been a turning point, and I know you can tell he knows he has lost Kashmir.
Very interesting. I have a couple of other questions also, Dr. Rakisits. I will come back to you, but let me go back to Zaffar Qureshi. You were talking about the ground situation.
Reading on the Economic Times and the Indian media, this is not the first time that the Indian army is doing committing such an atrocities on the civilians of Kashmir. We've seen previously, as you mentioned, Dr. Shakil, who was tied to the jeeps, and it's just fortunate enough that the Economic Times and the Indian media is now picking up. Every day, the Indian Army, which is around over 900,000 Indian forces that are situated in Kashmir, are committing rapes, human rights violations. Yesterday, a day before yesterday, a young boy, Mehrajuddin, was shot, who was just walking down through the checkpoint, and he was shot and martyred on spot, even though he was not doing anything. Now, these are such crimes that the Indian government is doing under this pretense of COVID-19, where it's trying to utilize this opportunity to change the demographic, kill the innocent, especially targeting the young youth of Kashmiri people. Now, we need to realize the international community has to come together and realize that India, under the secular democratic banner, is committing a gross human rights violations on the ground, even at this hour when the whole world is trying to save the humanity from COVID-19. India is using this opportunity to kill the innocent Muslims of Kashmir. As Claude said, this is not just about human rights violations. It is about the right of self-determination, the freedom of people of Kashmir who've been denied their inalienable right of self-determination.
Absolutely.
For the last 70 years.
And Dr. Rakisits was also talking about it. The real problem is the right to self-determination. You can kill as many people as you want, but that does not really solve the problem here. Thank you so much. That was Zaffar Qureshi speaking with us. Let me go back to Dr. Rakisits here. Dr. Rakisits, there is a larger problem also. Of course, Kashmir has its own specificities, and we have to look at them. But there is a larger problem. We have on this program been talking about that problem, in fact, with Indians, the discerning Indians, that there is the RSS agenda, which is about a Hindu Rashtra. Maps are circulating which show India to stretch from the western end of Afghanistan to Burma, and includes Bangladesh, Pakistan, and present-day India. So there's this Hindu Rashtra, which is exclusionary. And the expression of that we're seeing also in India in relation to minorities, especially in relation to Muslims. So give me your sense of this larger picture, which obviously subsumes many other problems.
The problem is what it means, basically, is that the Muslims in India are effectively becoming a second-class citizen. And that is nothing really new. I mean, they have been at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder in India since partition. So it's a long time. But what the difference now under the Modi regime is that this is becoming now almost a formality. It's becoming a formal policy to want to, especially if you're looking at, there was the registration of the
Citizenship Amendment Act, yeah. CAA.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Then the national registry, which of course mostly affects the people at the lowest rank of the socioeconomic ladder, who happen to be Muslims. And so there are loads of issues that Prime Minister Modi is doing, which are specifically targeting the Muslims of India. And Kashmir is another one. And what he's doing in Kashmir not only is bad for the Kashmiris, but this will inevitably have a knock-on effect and a flowback effect into the rest of India about an anti-Muslim movement, an anti-Muslim feeling. And I think what's going to happen is that Muslims in the rest of India are going to start feeling more and more bitter towards the central government of Delhi, specifically Modi's. And what he's actually doing, Modi, is completely, counterproductive. Is that he's actually weakening his own state. a country that not only
Well,
pretends to be the largest...
he seems to think, or at least his coterie seem to think that they're actually strengthening the Hindu Rashtra. But stay with me, Dr. Rakisits. I'm also joined by Faisal Naqvi, who's an eminent lawyer, advocate, Supreme Court of Pakistan. Mr. Naqvi, thank you for your time. We were talking about, there are lots of stories and these facts have come out, and this is not the first time, that the Indian occupation forces have actually used civilians to plant explosives before going in to, destroy the houses, send in civilians first as probes. They have also been destroying fruit orchards and the rest of it. So give me a sense whether any of these practices can be condoned in some way by international law.
Not at all. The use of civilians as human shields is specifically prohibited by the Geneva Convention, the Geneva Convention number 3, and more appropriately, Geneva Convention number 4, as well as by the additional protocol. And it is a, part of the customary law of war that you cannot use individuals as human shields. In fact, under the Rome Statute, this is classified as a war crime. So by sending civilians out to essentially protect soldiers, Indian forces are committing what the international community would recognize as a war crime. And in fact, there are examples where people have been prosecuted for these crimes in the past, both in the Second World War and in the context of the war in what used to be called Yugoslavia.
Dr. Rakisits, Faisal Naqvi is saying that there is absolutely no provision, not even an emergency provision in international law that would condone the use of civilians or putting them in harm's way or making them part of a conflict.
Yeah, well, I fully agree. I'm sure Advocate Naqvi is absolutely correct. I mean, there will be no such authorization or legality in doing any such thing. I mean, so what the Indian Army is doing now is totally illegal. I mean, it's the fact is the world knows this and is doing nothing about it. But as I said, it has come to the attention of the international community, and ultimately they are going to be brought. The Indian government's going to have to basically explain itself eventually. But there's so many other bigger issues that the international community wants to, is involved in, including the COVID-19 issue, but other bigger strategic issue, which is like the big confrontation between China and the United States, that in many ways they look at Kashmir and they just don't think it's important enough. Sadly,
no, that's a very important point. But let me ask you things, since you've had extensive experience of working with the Australian government in the Departments of Defense and Foreign Affairs. Do you think that people in the Department of Defense, or more so in the Department of Foreign Affairs and generally in the Australian government, would actually be looking at this and saying to themselves, well, this is increasingly becoming untenable. How do we deal with this?
Well, I left the public service over 15 years ago as a starter, and I'm speaking completely as a civilian.
But given your experience,
yeah, they would definitely be aware of what is happening in India, and I suspect they would feel very uncomfortable with what's happening in India. Because there's this whole thing about the Quad, which I'm sure you've heard of, which is a quadrilateral between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia.
Yeah.
And they are the democracies, and they will be there to sort of work together, not as a formal coalition, but they will be there to assist each other, possibly militarily. Now, if one of them, in this case, let's be specific, India, is not acting in the most democratic fashion, or certainly not the way a democracy as we know it would behave, that would make some people, I'm sure, in the departments here in Australia and certainly in Japan and the United States, feel uncomfortable. And this is why the silence on the Twitter sphere and on just an internet in general is deafening about what is happening in India. They say nothing about it.
Absolutely.
And that says a lot.
Let me go back to Mr. Naqvi. Mr. Naqvi, considering that, categorically and unequivocally, there is no provision in international law that would condone such actions, what exactly can Pakistan do as a state that supports the Kashmiri right to self-determination politically and diplomatically? Is this something, given that there is empirical evidence of this, is this something that we can take to the UNSC or to the UN General Assembly or to any of the many UN organs?
Proper body to go to is the UN Human Rights Council. They are charged with the enforcement and the implementation of Article 6 of the ICCPR. There are people who've already done work. They can appoint a special rapporteur to look into these issues. So that is the body that we should be dealing with.
Okay. If this constitutes a war crime, is there any other avenue that we can explore?
I think it's fairly difficult to find jurisdiction under the Rome Statute because Pakistan itself is not a member, India is not a member, and so it would be difficult to take it there. Pakistan would. There are some arguments as to how we could raise it as a war crime, but I think it's a fairly simple point. You don't necessarily have to go under the Rome Statute to raise it as a war crime. You can raise it also in the UN General Assembly. Using humans as civilians as human shields is forbidden even in the time of war. And let me be clear, India does not accept if there is an armed conflict so far as the ordinary Kashmiri civilian is concerned. So the ordinary Kashmiri civilian is, as per India's own position, only governed by human rights law. And there is absolutely no argument that you cannot use ordinary civilians in ordinary peacetime as human shields. So this is a complete and blatant violation of the human rights of the Kashmiris. It should be raised at the international level. We should raise it at the UN General Assembly as well. But in my view, the best place to raise it is at the UNHRC, and perhaps ask for the appointment of a special rapporteur to look into these issues, as there have been other rapporteurs in the past as well.
So is this something that we need to push for? I mean, the Foreign Office needs to pick this up, or should the Prime Minister's office pick this up? And actually, the Kashmir Task Force needs to sit down and look at how to take this up and, how to make that intervention effective?
I mean, we need to have support for a resolution at the Human Rights Council. And we need to engage with the other members, and we need to be able to present our position more effectively. Now, part of it comes down to, I would say, the parochialism of the Foreign Office, which doesn't want to engage any outsiders. But there are international, let's say, counsel available. For example, Amal Clooney is raising issues for other people at the level of these institutions. And Helena Kennedy is a famous English QC who deals with these issues. We should be talking to these people, engaging them, and getting professional assistance. So It's not just a question of saying that, the Foreign Office should go there and having the local Pakistani or Kashmiri community stand around with a few placards when somebody comes into town. There is also an official sort of network which needs to be engaged with. It requires diplomacy, and our diplomats are very good. Our foreign service members are very good, but this is a specialized subject as well. So you need to know how to navigate those particular corridors, not just those of the UN General Assembly. And it requires work. When a year ago, after the August 5th annexation of Kashmir, Pakistan went to the Human Rights Council, but really wasn't even able to get a very strong statement. So we need to push these issues there. These are black and white issues of human rights. Because if you cannot do something, even in times of war, which is to say that you cannot use people as human shields, then you certainly cannot use Kashmiri civilians as human shields in times of peace, which is what India claims is the situation right now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Claude, Rakisits, and Faisal Hussain Naqvi. Thank you to both of you for your insights into this issue. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the political situation in Israel. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus News. We move to Israel, where politics has remained deadlocked for 18 months, is now facing resistance by Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party to a deal he had signed with his main rival, Benny Gantz. Netanyahu had formally notified President Rivlin that he had formed a government which he will present to Parliament on Thursday. That was yesterday. Earlier, Netanyahu was tasked by Rivlin to put together a new government after his former rival Benny Gantz failed to do so. Last month, Netanyahu and Gantz signed a deal to form a power-sharing government. Under the agreement, Netanyahu will serve as Prime Minister for at least 18 months before being replaced by Gantz. However, the swearing-in has been postponed until Sunday to buy time for Netanyahu to quell infighting within his Likud party. For his part, Benny Gantz, Netanyahu's erstwhile bitter rival and critic, agreed to dissolve his blue and white party and also reneged on a key campaign promise not to serve under Netanyahu. Gantz has tried to deflect criticism by arguing that he has teamed up with Netanyahu only to avoid a fourth election. To discuss where the situation is headed, we are joined by Emmanuel Navon, who is a French-born Israeli political scientist and foreign policy expert and teaches at the Tel Aviv University. Mr. Navon, thank you for joining us. There was a sense of, we know that there's some problem with how the cabinet positions are being, shared, but this seems to be a pretty, choppy waters, both for Gantz as well as for Netanyahu. Netanyahu had finally stitched something together, but now he has to deal with members of Likud, and he also has to deal with the corruption charges against him. So where exactly does the situation stand?
Well, the current deadlock, which is supposed to end on Sunday with the final swearing in of the government, first of all, is not related to the lawsuit against Netanyahu. I mean, he's been indicted by the Attorney General, but according to Israeli law, an indicted prime minister can continue to serve and only has to resign if he's convicted. When it comes to the rocky relation with Benny Gantz and his blue and white party, the problem here is that it is a coalition government with the same amount of ministers and the same amount of jobs for each party, which was a demand that had been presented by Benny Gantz, except that the party of Benny Gantz is much smaller than Likud and its allies. And therefore, Netanyahu is short of government positions for his own Likud MKs. And last night, there was kind of a rebellion within his party, with MKs being extremely frustrated with either not being granted any job in the government or minor jobs, and therefore he asked for another 48 hours to try and work it out over the weekend and try to make, if not everybody, most MKs happy, and hopefully this is what will happen on Sunday.
So this criticism that Gantz has tried to deflect by saying that he has teamed up because he didn't want a fourth election, do you think this is something that that is accurate, or he's just trying to put a good face on sheer political opportunism?
No, it is factually true that if Gantz had not joined a coalition with Netanyahu, we would indeed have headed for a fourth election, which Benny Gantz rightly said was the worst possible outcome. The problem with Benny Gantz is that he had the recommendation of 61 MKs to the president to grant him the priority to form a government. So theoretically, he could have formed a government, but in fact, out of those 61 MKs, which is a majority out of the Knesset's 120, 2 of those MKs said they would not vote for a 61 government that would include the united list of the Arab parties because of the radical politics of those parties, and therefore Benny Gantz did not, in fact, have a government. And therefore, the only option was to join a coalition.
So essentially, Gantz tried to, I mean, he basically did not want to take a bold decision. But anyway, give me a sense of how Netanyahu plans to get out of this lawsuit bind. Is he going to use the Knesset to change the law, or you know, somehow he needs to find wiggle room to save himself? No.
No, there's not going to be any change to the law in Israel. Netanyahu's trial is going to start in less than a week. On the 24th of May, this is final. He will go to court. He will be judged, and then either the court will find him guilty or innocent. But one of the conditions of Gantz to form this coalition government was to grant the Justice Ministry to his Blue and White Party and to prevent any change of legislation that was meant to shield the Prime Minister from being prosecuted and put on trial. So Netanyahu is going to go to court trying to defend himself, having been, as I said, indicted by the Attorney General over 3 cases of corruption. And the court will either decide that he's guilty or innocent, but as I said, by Israeli law, he is entitled to serve as prime minister while indicted and would only have to resign if convicted.
Will have to resign if convicted. Thank you so much. That was Emmanuel Navon speaking with us with reference to the political situation in Israel. We are now joined by Leila Hatoum, a journalist and analyst from Beirut. Thank you, Leila, for being on the program. I was talking about the political situation in Israel. We have also seen that Benny Gantz has essentially reneged on what he said about not serving under Netanyahu. He also could not hold the coalition with the Arab parties. But give me a sense of how the Palestinians are looking at this, you know, in terms of the expected annexation of settlements and the Jordan Valley, the future of the humanitarian understandings in Gaza, a possible conflict with Hamas. What is your sense of that?
Well, I've been speaking to a lot of Palestinians over the past few months, and not only Palestinians, but also Arabs and Lebanese, because Lebanese and Palestinians are mainly concerned with what's happening in Israel and the newly formed cabinet. I mean, if you look at its members, based on who they are and what's their background, it will impact both countries, both the occupied Palestinian territories and the Lebanese territories as well. The Palestinians are not happy with what's happening, with what they're seeing, because they do believe that the Israelis will move soon after to annex parts of the West Bank, if not all of it, the Jordan Valley as well, but that would be the last straw as well for the Jordanians. I was speaking to a Jordanian colleague last night, and he said that that would be the last straw for them. It might ignite war if they actually also annex the Jordanian Valley. But you have to look at this cabinet and who does it have in it. I mean, you know, there's Ejaz Haider, who's going to be the new comms minister. He's the communications minister. Ejaz Haider was the former director of communications for Bibi Netanyahu back in 2012. But he's also a naval, he's a commando officer. He's a lieutenant colonel in the IDF, in the Israeli occupation forces, IOF actually. He served under the Commando Naval Unit, Shayatit 13, which took part in the Israeli aggression on Lebanon back in 2006, and the Operation Cast Lead against Gaza in 2008. So the idea is that they had appointed somebody with a strong military background. He's well seasoned in war to be the communications minister. He does have a degree in history, and he had worked in communications before, so that should tell you one thing. Going forward, they're looking for confrontation, and they need somebody who can handle military communications to the rest of the world when they actually annex more Arab lands. They do have, for example, the justice minister at one point or another, she is not going to take any action against Bibi Netanyahu because there's an agreement between Netanyahu and between Benny Gantz that I've known of since February 2020, literally a few months back, and I wrote about it on Twitter when nobody actually believed me, and now it's happening. There was an under-the-table agreement between Bibi Netanyahu and Benny Gantz that they would not address the coronavirus issue. They had thousands of people who were infected back in February, but they never addressed it because they were going into elections in March. And by March, they had agreed on some form of how they're going to handle the newly formed cabinet. And now we're seeing it now. They joined hands. It's really funny that Benny Gantz, who 2 years ago went into politics from being an admired army general to kick out Bibi Netanyahu, the corrupt politician who had been sitting in his place for the past decade or so, if not more. And the idea is that when he goes on Wednesday and he says, we're going to put personal issues on the side and we're going to form this cabinet, the coalition, it makes me laugh because you don't have personal issues with Bibi Netanyahu. You have issues with him based on your nationality as an Israeli. For example, at one point, as an Israeli, you should say, I want to defend Israel from corrupt people. So if you have joined politics for personal reasons, then you're not the national hero everybody was looking at in Israel. And if you joined basically politics to kick out Bibi Netanyahu, then you shouldn't be having personal issues with him. You should have national interest in kicking him out, and that's different. On Monday, he signed this agreement with Bibi Netanyahu, and I believe that he extended him a life support line.
Yeah, but let's see because now Netanyahu is to deal with the troubles in his own Likud party in terms of cabinet sharing and the rest of it. But I'm also joined by Professor Kamel Hawaash, who's an academic and engineer. Professor Hawaash, thank you for being on the program. Give me a sense of whether there is any space today in Israel, and I say this in terms of the outside world and especially the Palestinians looking at the politics there. And at some point they could have said, well, if Netanyahu loses and XYZ comes in, then there is a likelihood of move towards peace. But it seems to me, and I might be wrong, that today there is no space left in Israel for any kind of settlement with the Palestinians that actually honors the Palestinians' right to their land and self-dignity.
You're right, there is no space for settlement. There's space for settlements, as in illegal colonies that are built in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and so on. I mean, the reality is, let's be clear, when Netanyahu announced a few months ago that he was intending to annex the Jordan Valley and the northern Dead Sea, what did Benny Gantz say if we thought he was going to be the dove? He said that was my idea in the first place. So no, there is no room. What you have is a combination of a very right-wing government in Israel, led and heavily influenced by the settlers, who are also pushed into not compromising with the Palestinians, if I can call it that. And it's not a compromise. The Palestinians have rights. And that is all being led by the Americans, in fact, not only by President Trump himself, but in the person who sits in the American embassy now in Jerusalem, David Friedman, who is more determined to see the largest possible Israel than anyone else, than even possibly the Israelis themselves. So there is no room for the Palestinians to be discussed. There's more and more usage of the term Judea and Samaria when they talk about the West Bank. Jerusalem is supposedly off the table. The refugees don't exist, and UNRWA must be dismantled. So there is no space. And the Palestinians, really, on the day of the Nakba, of the catastrophe, which has lasted now for 72 years, have got to, and I mean by that the leadership, have got to realize that and go back to their people and reformulate the national liberation project that the people deserve after 72 years, because it's not going to come from Israeli politicians.
Okay, so give me a sense of the worst case scenario here. What exactly is the game plan here? I mean, is it to just simply subsume the Palestinians into a larger Israeli state? If they do so as a democracy, the Palestinians will have the same rights. What kind of scenario are we looking at? Because Obviously, the Palestinians are not going to accept this. And if they are not going to accept this, and if the Israelis double down on this absolutely madcap US plan, then we are looking at conflict, some kind of conflagration.
Well, what we have at least is apartheid. That is for sure. Because if there is, if Israel rules over the whole land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, but that the Palestinians don't have the same rights as Jews who live in that area, then you can only describe it as apartheid. I mean, we have it already because settlements are only for Jews, for a start. If you go to Hebron, you walk down the street and, you know, there's somewhere for the Palestinians to walk and another place for the... So, first of all, Israel is moving rapidly towards being confirmed as the world's 21st century apartheid state. There are equal numbers, if not more Palestinians than Jewish Israelis now in that land. So any suggestion that Israel could rule over that land and maintain what it claims to be its reputation as Jewish and democratic falls completely by the wayside. If Israel really wanted peace, it would have accepted what the Palestinian leadership accepted, even though the Palestinian people themselves will not give up on the aspirations to return to Haifa and Jaffa and the places they came from, because that's where they came from. It's not that they want to destroy anyone, that's where they came from. But instead, Israel thinks, the situation in the Middle East is that the Palestinians have little support, really meaningful support. In fact, that some states are normalizing with Israel in the Middle East, some of the Gulf states particularly. And in addition to that, you have a very weak Palestinian leadership, and really ailing leadership. We're talking about quite a few of them in their 70s and 80s who have tried their best. And let's just say that it is about time that they moved on and let someone else take over. But that the Palestinians have got to get their house in order. There has to be unity. There's absolutely no excuse for the division between Fatah and Hamas. So the first point is about unity, that the Palestinian institutions, such as the PLO, the Palestinian National Council, and so on, must be reinvigorated in a democratic way to really absorb all Palestinians, including those like myself who lives abroad, who calls himself a Palestinian, but asks, how do I get representation as a Palestinian in the diaspora? So you've got these elements. First of all, the division must end, the institutions have to be revitalized, and then to look at where we are now and what the Palestinian people as a whole really want to achieve. Because, again, things have changed very rapidly over the last 3 years, particularly since Trump took office in the White House. And it is time for the Palestinians to reevaluate that, to draw on the great skills and the educated people who can advise to actually revitalize their plan for national liberation, so it is clear to everyone what it is that they want. And when they do that, I think they'll be in a much better position to say to the world, we are united, we have rights, here's what they are, the refugees have a right to return, we accept whatever solution they come up with after these consultations, and they rally support around to achieve that.
Okay. I'm with very little time, perhaps a couple of minutes. Leila, very quickly, if there is no space for dialogue, then the only option left is a conflict. But at the same time, Israel is reaching out to various Arab states, including the Gulf states, as Professor Hawaash was just talking about. So what kind of space? I mean, unity and all of that is great. I mean, I completely agree with the professor. But is that a possibility?
I don't believe that it's going to be possible at all with the Israelis. I mean, there's an ideology over here that has been implemented over the past 70 years, bit by bit. The idea, I look at it from a strategy point of view. They are trying to gather as much support from other states in the Arab world, divide and conquer. So by the time they annex the lands that they want, when the people of those lands start doing resistance, they will be called terrorists as usual. But then again, you will not have Arabs supporting them. We already started seeing it bit by bit because of the conflict between the GCC nations and Iran. Anything that Iran touches is now labeled as terrorist. irrespective if the people of that land are actually fighting an occupation or not, irrespective. So the idea is that it's a strategy to divide and conquer, gather as much alliances with the Israeli dream against anybody who actually fights it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Leila, Hatoum. Thank you, Professor Kamel, Hawaash. This is all from Indus Special for this week. We shall see you next Thursday at the same time. For latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.